I don't know. These planers just keep multiplying around here. I don't know what goes on when I go home at night. I think maybe the Northfield and the Wood Miser got together and had a little baby Powermatic. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So we're talking about one of my favorite subjects today, woodworking equipment, specifically planers. Happy New Year, by the way. I guess you could say maybe I bought myself a little Christmas present. I know you're probably thinking, what are you doing with that little toy? It's a 15-inch Powermatic. Looks kind of ridiculous next to the 25-inch Northfield. I had to have it. Let me explain a little bit. So I had multiple reasons for buying this little planer. I've been looking on Marketplace and Craigslist for quite a while, about 2 months. I've been looking, thinking if I find the right deal, I'm going to pick up a little tiny planer. But it had to hit my specs of what I was looking for. I needed one thing in particular. You see, that Northfield there is a great machine. I absolutely love everything about it. It has tremendous power. It puts a really nice finish on the boards most of the time. But what it does have is straight knives. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the old-fashioned straight knife planers. It's just simply a straight cutter head. In fact, I can show you here on the Wood Miser real quick. That one's a little bit tougher to open up, but this one's easy to open up. Straight cutter knives. Ancient technology. Works great 90% of the time. But I have a job coming up, which this is going to be another video. We're not going to get too much into it today, where I got to make a set of Hickory stair treads. Well, if you guys have ever planed Hickory, yeah, you know, a few curse words are going to come out along the way. It is just a miserable wood to work with. Beautiful wood, it's one of my favorites, but it is tough. Well, let me just show you here why the Northfield is just struggling with the Hickory. So I sharpened my knives before I started this project to make sure, because I knew it was going to be a challenge. And, you know, you'll be planing for the most part pretty nice, and then you'll hit something like this. Tremendous tear out. I'll talk more about Hickory in general when we do the stair tread video, but some woods are just very tough. They have tough spiral grain that kind of interlocks, and there's just no good way to plane it. You know, you could turn this board around and this would plane smooth, but then probably somewhere else you'd have tear out. So, how many of you guys have learned something over the years and then forgot it and had to relearn it? Yeah, that's me on this project. Some of you might already be able to figure out why I had to buy this planer. So I'm holding out on you. I'll just show you. Let me take the hood off here. It's got a helix head cutter head in it. Now, I've owned a few planers in my career. I had a 20-inch Grizzly that basically was a bigger version of this, had the same cutter head in, the nicest finishing planer I ever had. Just outgrew it. Didn't have enough power, didn't hold up. Everything else about the machine kind of fell apart, but the cutter head was phenomenal. So then I upgraded to a big old Powermatic. I'm talking the big old green Powermatics from the 70s, a little bit smaller than that Northfield. That was also a 20-inch. I had a custom spiral head built for that one because that came with straight knives, and I put in a spiral head. And that was a good planer, ran it for many years, but I kind of outgrew that one. That was a 10-horse, that was underpowered, and I was never happy with that spiral head. It kind of soured me on spiral heads because it just left like perpendicular lines down the board from where the cutters sat, and there's nothing I could ever do to straighten that out, and I had to sand everything. It just kind of started to irritate me, and also the cost of the carbide inserts was getting so expensive. It was costing me a fortune. Even though these last pretty long, I planed through a lot of wood, and you know, it was cost me over $500 a clip to replace them. And the time it takes, anybody who's ever done this job knows it is extremely tedious. So I was getting hours into spinning carbide. So when I decided it was time to upgrade, and I found this Northfield and totally restored it, that was pre-YouTube. That unfortunately didn't make it. I wish I was doing YouTube at the time. That was a nice project. But I totally redid this whole thing, and it had a straight knife head in it, and it has the onboard grinder, which I love. It's fast, it's simple, it gives a perfect finish in most woods. But I try not to work with hickory much. So I haven't planed any hickory through that in the 2 years I've been running it. Well, I got a rude awakening on the limitations of straight knives, which I knew, but I've been spoiled because I ran spiral heads for so long that you take it for granted until you don't have it. So I had to go out and get myself a spiral head planer. So this is a 15-inch Powermatic, nothing special. 3 horsepower. I mean, I've gone completely full circle in the world of planers. This is actually the smallest planer I've ever owned. I started with an 18-inch, went to a 20, to a 20, bigger 20, to a 25 with 15 horsepower. I'm back down to a puny little 15 with a 3 horsepower. But this is exactly what I wanted. You may be thinking, well, why don't you just put a spiral head on the Northfield? I'd love to, but the spiral head alone for that costs over twice as much as I paid for this entire planer. Not to mention, that is a major, major job to change out that giant cutter head that I don't want to get into. So that's not changing. The second purpose of this thing, besides being able to do tough, tricky jobs, it is light. I can lift it, it's on wheels, I can roll it around. When I'm not using it, it's going over into the corner of the shop out of the way. It runs on single phase power versus 3-phase. I already have a 240 heavy extension cord, so I can literally put this thing anywhere. I've got 240 outlets around here, down at my other building. I can just tap a dust hose from the molder or whatever. So this thing is extremely flexible. The other limitation I have with this Northfield, my shop isn't huge here. I'm limited to about 13 foot is what I can get in and plane through this. So when I have to do really long stuff, I did 2 projects this fall where I had to do between 16 and 20 foot, I can just take this outside and just set up a temporary dust collection and just run the long stuff outside, handle it with the forklift, set up roller tables, just make my life a lot easier so I don't have to try to shoehorn long stuff through the shop here. So for those 2 reasons alone, it was worth picking this thing up. And I got a pretty fair deal on it, to be honest with you. The homeowner was done with it for his projects and wanted it gone, so I went and picked it up. So should be a pretty nice machine. We'll talk a little bit about these spiral cutter heads if you're not familiar, because, well, this might not be making much sense to you. I think most woodworkers have seen them and are somewhat familiar. Now, this one is a little bit wet because we had a temperature inversion here overnight, and it went from cold to really warm, and moisture condensed on this cutter head. But anyway, that won't hurt anything. So some people call them spiral heads, some people call them helix heads. Every helix head is a spiral head, but not every spiral head is a helix head. So the key to this, why this does such a phenomenal job, if you look at this close, these inserts, and these are carbide inserts, and each one of these is a cutting face. They're on a slight angle, and they helix around the cutter head. Now just a regular spiral head is going to have inserts like this, but they're at 90 degrees to the sides of the machine, to the table, so they just cut like a regular straight knife. They don't have the shearing action that these helix heads have with that slight angle. And each one of these overlaps the next row, so that's how that works. You have this gap here, but it's overlapped by the next one, so it makes a nice cutting surface, and it just kind of peels the wood at an angle instead of just chopping it like straight knives do. So that makes a world of difference. So that's the big advantage. They cut nice, they're quieter than a straight knife planer because you don't have that slap, slap, slap. The blade is always in the wood. There's always a cutter that's contacting the wood. So it just kind of peels. I guess in a weird way, I'm probably describing this wrong and somebody will probably tell me I'm wrong, but in a way it's kind of like a pencil sharpener, the way it kind of just slices instead of chopping. But that's the big advantage. These carbide inserts are nice, so you don't actually sharpen these. When you get a nick or something, which I'm looking at here, it looks like somebody, there's a little bit of a nick there. You can just turn it. You can turn one or you can turn all of them. So typically if you have a big blowout or something, a problem with one, you'll just turn one. And when they all start to seem getting dull, you'll turn each and every one of them. That's one of the downsides. As I mentioned, that is a tedious job. It's not fun. These all have to be perfectly clean because if you get sawdust trapped underneath, then they won't be on the same plane and you'll get ridges. I never liked that about helix heads. That's not fun. But when they're dialed in right, they work very nice. Another downside that nobody ever talks about, and I can tell you for a fact, these use more horsepower than straight knives. So if you're buying a planer, keep that in consideration because that is something that will frustrate you. Trust me, I've spent a lot of time frustrated by that. My 20-inch Powermatic with the 10 horsepower motor, you'd think, oh, that's a big planer. I would bog that down all the time with my spiral cutter head, just because having that constant contact in the wood, it's always pulling a load on that motor. It's not like straight knives where they hit and recharge, hit and recharge, hit and recharge. That 15 horsepower Northfield, now granted it's 15 horsepower, that will walk through anything, and I guarantee you if I put a spiral head on that, it would not perform as good as the straight knives do with just general planing, with hogging away a lot of material. So that is one downside, especially with these small planers, which I know that going into this is not going to be a rough planer. I'm only going to use this to finish plane material, real fine light cuts, because that is the limits of this machine. If you buy a machine like this with a 3 horsepower motor and a helix head, and you think you're gonna take off an 1/8 inch, it's not gonna happen. I know the specs, I know what they say these machines are gonna do. Let me tell you the truth, cut that in half. This is not a whole lot better than like a benchtop planer, to be honest with you, because of this helix cutter head takes more power. And none of the equipment companies are going to tell you that, but hopefully that alone is worth watching this video. So I'm typically of the camp, buy as much power as you can run. But there is a spot for finesse too. It all depends what you're trying to do. So this should be a good machine. Like I said, I had one almost identical to it in a 20-inch version with a Grizzly. And honestly, these are Taiwan planers. They're all the same, Jet, Grizzly, Powermatic. Fit and finish is a little different. The Powermatic fit and finish is a little bit nicer than a Grizzly, but the basic framework of the machine, they're all exactly the same. And the 20-inch is just a bigger version of the 15. So I'm pretty familiar with this machine. There's not going to be a whole lot of surprises here, I don't think. As long as it works. I mean, I haven't even plugged this thing in and run it yet. It's been sitting here for about a week. So as long as I didn't buy a lemon, it should work pretty good. So this is actually a bird head in here. The Powermatics use bird heads. I'm not sure if Grizzly uses actual bird heads or if it's a knockoff, but for those of you that are shopping, Bird, BYRD, is pretty much the gold standard of helix heads. So they're pretty nice, and you can actually retrofit just about any planer with a bird head. They'll sell you an aftermarket head. That's my short tutorial on planer cutter heads. I'm going to button this thing up, we'll plug it in, we'll run a board or two. We'll see the difference between straight knives and helix head. So after rummaging around in all my spare dust collection parts, as you can see, covered in dust, I'm hacked in here to my ripsaw line, and I got power on, and I just started it up, and it does in fact start. So I'm going to take this piece right here because the proof's in the pudding, and we're going to run this through, and we're going to compare what you see there with what we're about to get. Hopefully this thing doesn't make me a liar. Well, let's see how we did. Not too shabby. You can see here, a couple of those cutters probably need to be spun. A little bit of faint lines there. That's all right. These stair treads are going to go through my drum sander anyway, so I'll sand that out if I'm feeling too lazy to change the inserts. But the main thing, you can see this area here is going to be tough no matter what, because even with this helix head, there's just a little bit of tear out there. That's just tough. I don't know if the camera picks up how this grain just kind of spins and swirls here. That's difficult planing no matter how you cut it. But if you have the option, helix cutter head is definitely worthwhile. Like I said, there are some drawbacks that everybody wants to say, oh, they're the best thing in the world. There are a few drawbacks to them. Mainly the time to maintain them, the extra horsepower it takes, the added cost. But depending on what you're doing, they are worth their weight. So I got to keep going. The next video is going to be on those Hickory stair treads. That's going to be an interesting one. They're going to be beautiful. So like, subscribe, do all that stuff to stick around here and catch all the adventures I'm working on here in the shop and down at the sawmill. But that's it. You'll be seeing more of that little girl. Still kind of think it looks silly here next to all this big stuff, but hey, bigger isn't always better. I'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for watching.